all over America, pretty much spontaneously almost, in college communities and big cities, these groups would develop. And what came out of it was similar problems, similar ways of being treated by the world, and often similar desires.
These young women had a much more sweeping vision of change than their sisters in now. They called it women's liberation.
It was heady and exciting and naive, imagining that if we just explained it to people, it was so unjust that surely it would change.
Marriage is, as I've said, is unpaid labor. I mean, no woman is a free household slave for each man.
Society itself would have to take major collective responsibility for the care and the rearing of children.
Every man oppresses women. I mean, they have the chance to oppress the women they marry.
Meeting in small groups, women began to discuss their private experiences for the first time. They called it consciousness raising.
Consciousness raising was the thing. That is how we learned about our lives. That is how we learned that we were not alone in what was happening to us.
These first small groups began to compare notes. And whenever an oppressed people compare notes, it's just bloody dynamite, because first of all, it's the, oh, you too moment.
What we discovered was we all had fathers who browbeat our mothers. We all went out for jobs and only found that we could look in the women jobs wanted column. We all faked orgasms.
Did I ever fake an orgasm? Oh, you bet I faked an orgasm.
Oh.
You gotta understand, our minds were being blown. Everything was wide open, and it was a very scary, fertile, exciting, exhilarating time.
The new ideas of women's liberation, born in consciousness-raising groups, jumped from campus to campus and city to city.
It spread very, very fast. I can't believe how fast it spread. So many radical ideas could be passed on. For example, there would be a conference at Berkeley, and all these pamphlets about sexuality, about childcare, about education, any item that affected women, all these pamphlets would be sitting on a table. Where did they come from?
I read my way into feminism. I read The Myth of the Vaginal Orgasm. I read Housework is a Women's Issue. I read stuff I would never have encountered otherwise that radicalized me.
Women drew from their most intimate personal experiences a whole new worldview. They coined a phrase for it. The personal is political.
It was as if a great floodlight had gone on and illuminated not only all of my experience, but everything in the world. And I was able to see how everything that I had thought about or cared about was connected, and there was so much to be done.
In 1968, women's liberationists introduced themselves to the American public with a protest against one of America's most cherished institutions.
Girls all over the country would watch the Miss America pageant and think, oh, that's the model, that's what I've got to be like.
The winner should have talent, looks, personality, looks, poise, and looks. Everybody's got talent.
They were supposed to have a talent like baton twirling, but not to be an artist. They were supposed to feel comfortable in high heels and bathing suits, parading around while men whistled.
This year's crop seems to be the most beauteous bevy of breathtaking beauties in decades.
At the time of the Miss America pageant, Robin Morgan was an anti-war activist.
I announced that I was thinking of organizing this thing at Atlantic City, and all of the men couldn't believe it. They said, but that's just a women's thing. How can you, it's just a Miss America. Oh my God.
On September 7th, Morgan and hundreds of other women gathered on the boardwalk outside the Atlantic City Convention Center.
We did have a sense of humor, and we had a certain panache of outrageousness.
No more pain, no more trying to hold the flag in vain.
We had a freedom trash can in which we threw what we called objects of women's oppression, like brooms and dustpans and curlers, high-heeled shoes and bras and girdles. Oh, those girdles.
I threw my 16-year-old son's Playboy magazines in it. And I said something like, "Women, use your brains."
We crowned a live sheep on the boardwalk because Miss America and the contestants were sheep. I disagree with this. First of all, it was unfair to the sheep.
At a certain point, a small group went inside. They had a huge banner with the words, "Women's Liberation." And when the TV cameras were panning the audience up in the balcony, they unfurled the banner. And all over the country, everybody saw those words, "Women's Liberation."
Though few in number, women's liberationists knew how to turn bold public actions into media coverage, expanding the reach of their ideas.
30 seconds on the 6 o'clock news was more important than leafleting on a corner on the Lower East Side for 6 years.
Somebody would come up with a great idea. Then it would just go like wildfire through this small community of radical feminists. The date would be set, and we would just show up.
Oh, you're the strong silent type. Those men, those sex objects.
There was the whistling on Wall Street.
Those pants, they just bring out your best.
We all went down there and started pinching the guys who came out of the offices.
Oh, what a chapeau. How about glasses? I like it with glasses.
Whispering in their ears and pawing them, and they didn't like it at all.
Look at the legs on that one.
August the 26th next could be an awful day for American males. That is the 50th anniversary of women's suffrage, and to celebrate it, the women's liberation movement proposes a nationwide strike.
Come join us in the march tomorrow.
On August 26th, feminist leaders summoned women all over the country for a show of force.
It was to be the first mass demonstration of the movement. We didn't have any idea how mass it would be until it happened.
I was scared to death that I would get to Fifth Avenue and see only a small group. When I got to 59th Street, I couldn't believe it. There were thousands and thousands, and you couldn't see the end of it.
In New York and cities across the country, women marched.
At first, the police gave us 2 lanes, but by the time everybody had gotten together, it was clear that 2 lanes wouldn't begin to contain us. So we spilled over, and we took over the entire Fifth Avenue.
It was so joyous. We were running and skipping and jumping, and there were children and there were men. We took the whole street.
There were women hanging out of the office building windows, cleaning women and secretaries and so on. And they would come down. Marching on Fifth Avenue for ourselves had a great feeling of exhilaration and freedom and community. Community isn't exactly enthusiastic enough, but contagiousness.
When do we want it? Now!
No sooner had the marches ended, however, than the national media sneered at them.
Are you going to act like ladies today?
Well, we are women. We act like women.
Why do you have such a small turnout here today?
The tone of much of the coverage of the women's movement was dismissive. It undercounted the number of women who were demonstrating. It suggested that the women who were demonstrating were not representative of everyday women.
The plain truth is that most American men are startled by the idea that American women generally are oppressed. And they read with relief the Gallup poll showing that 2/3 of the women don't think they're oppressed either.
The general perception was it's a small group of unsatisfied women.
Barbara Walters was one of the few women to fight her way into the exclusive men's club of network news in the 1960s.
The so-called women's movement was heating up. And I remember sending a memo to the president then of NBC News saying, shouldn't we do something on the women's movement? And scrawled on the top of my memo, it said, not enough interest.
With so many feminists in the world today, is a woman's place in the home?
Sometimes television talk show hosts would book radical feminists just to confront them.
The feminists who are here tonight, do you not believe a woman's place is in the home, right?
Of course not. It's a very oppressive concept. It's being used to oppress women and to make them think they're lucky to be slaves.
How many women in the home are slaves?
All women are slaves. They are unpaid. They are unpaid.
Sure enough, the strident views of radical feminists shocked and repelled many Americans.
What I objected to was that they were attacking what I was doing. They weren't talking just about themselves. Their point was that we should all feel that way, and that there was something really stupid about us if we didn't. It was the attack on our intellectual capacity, that if we had a brain in our head, we couldn't be happy changing that baby's diaper.
The oppression of the blacks.
Worried about alienating mainstream America, Betty Friedan tried to distance herself and the movement from the women's liberationists.
All that rubbish about slaves. They need to spend 3 days in a long boat.
They exaggerate. I'm for motherhood, and I'm for sex, and I'm for man, and two-sex society is here to stay. And I deal with the real world.
I believe that she was looking to join society as it existed, and the slightly younger parts of the movement were trying to transform society. And those were kind of two different goals.
Friedan was especially wary of lesbians, whom she once referred to as the Lavender Menace.
She feared our enemies would just disregard us as strange or far out or unnatural. Lesbian women were desperate to join the feminist movement. They were, in a way, our first feminists, long before we were. And we were not welcoming them.
Like many women, lesbians had found their voices through the women's movement.
I grew up in a moment when feminism was about to happen. I was ripe and ready for change.
Charlotte Bunch had married when she was 22 years old, but her world was turned upside down when she met fellow activist Rita Mae Brown.
To have somebody like Charlotte in my life, boom, it was an explosion, you know? It was a dream. I didn't have to explain things to her, she didn't explain things to me.
I came out as a lesbian and was involved in organizing around an understanding of why sexual choice and diversity was such an important issue, and why the control of women's sexuality was central to what happened in the women's movement.
But Bunch and Brown received a cold shoulder from the women's movement itself.
Those women, most of whom were rather privileged and very bright, treated lesbians the way men treated them. That's how it looked to me.
As long as homosexuals keep their sexual preference in private, the same as adulterers and adulteresses.
I think that they were afraid that if we were seen as lesbian, it would defeat the whole movement. And what we were trying to say is, that's to give in to the very forces that you're trying to change.
Well, the gay women left. What else could they do? If they didn't leave, they were being thrown out. And when that energy left, the women's movement suddenly became slower, much more, well, for lack of a better word, tedious.
It wasn't just lesbians who felt excluded. Women of color also saw little in the movement to move them.
I was very interested in women's issues because I was experiencing and had experienced sexism by that time myself. I just didn't see any place for me in it because it didn't seem to include the concerns and the issues of Black women and women of color.
One of the things that women of color and other marginalized women argue is that we have to broaden what you consider to be a women's issue. A woman who's living in public housing in